Yeah, it's great to see so many people here for, at the very end of term. I was a bit worried because this is the only time we could reschedule it for, and I was a bit worried that not many people would show up, and that would have been a mistake because I'm so delighted to have Emily here. I've only met you once before, right, when I went up to Durham to give a talk, but I only had to spend a few minutes talking to you when I realised that you definitely need to come down here and talk to all these people. So yeah, I feel like probably the people in this room know about your work more than I do, really. But obviously, one of the things that you work on is the history and philosophy of like epidemics and ecology, especially 19th century Victorian epidemics, which seems really cool. I also vaguely remember geeking out with you about like archives and like the philosophy of archives and things like that. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted you to come down here. I sort of had forgotten that I would need to do an introduction, so this is me kind of scrambling. You also kind of are on philosophers who live with cats, right? So some of the people in the room might know you through there, or at least know your cat through that. Oh no! Oh my God! I'm so sorry. I think I did know that. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry to bring that up right before you give it a. We can talk about that afterwards. But also you like run marathons, right? Yes. So cool. Anyway, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me down. As soon as I looked at the list of people that I'd be speaking to, I was like, and I've cited this person, and I've cited this person, and that's really exciting and slightly intimidating audience to speak to. And so it's been so wonderful. Everyone's been so welcoming. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theory that underlies my book project. So as Kirsten mentioned, I'm a historian by training, but I'm now finding myself in a philosophy department, and in doing so kind of learning that I share a lot in common with philosophers of biology and philosophers of history. Well, I get to challenge a lot of things that philosophers of history currently think, as per conversations with Adrian earlier today. And I think a lot about how history is done and the ways that things are changing. So from spillover diseases to re-emerging infectious diseases to COVID-19, things have really been front and center. Microbes have been kind of front and center in day-to-day life in recent years. And there are these serious and continuing threats to human and non-human health that seem to fly in the face of triumphalist narratives of the epidemiological transition that you might remember from the before times were quite common. Stories of disease eradication, stories of vaccine programs that were succeeding. And historians, disease ecologists, and others have started to look at the way that the COVID-19 pandemic really blows these narratives wide open and points to a form of kind of collective myopia that we had about the nature of the relationship between humans and microbes. And so it's been described as this moment where the natural world came crashing into the human world in quite a dramatic way, reminding us that the two are necessarily entwined, right? And in the fall of 2020, there was this group of leading environmental historians who came together to offer thoughts on the pandemic and highlighting, based on their own interdisciplinary expertises, the role of animals, systems of racial capitalism, urban green spaces, and other traditionally environmental topics, and how they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic as a reminder that humans and non-humans are inextricably linked. So, however, the particularly spectacular iteration of disease that's made us think about this connection again was not even close to the first time that historians have made the observation that the human and non-human world were interlinked, right? So from the mid-1980s, we have histories of HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and most recently SARS and MERS that include these lengthy reflections by historians and SDS scholars about the relationship between humans and non-human environments, right? And the relationship to the political, social, and economic treatment of disease. And yet, in the 40 plus years that historians have been making these observations, there's been, and decrying a kind of deficiency of frames for thinking through these diseases. A lot of them take on a kind of similar formula where they say there is X epidemic shows us that there's been this, relationship between human and non-human worlds that we've been ignoring, and we as historians need to adapt our frames to think about these worlds in a more productive way. But very few histories have actually undertaken the challenge of developing those frames. Most of the time, they kind of do historiographic reviews, like Linda Nash's Beyond Polluting Soils or Chris Sellers' To Place or Not to Place, where they talk about ways that historians should do this kind of work, but then the actual nitty-gritty work of developing those frameworks remains a task for someone else. And so the closest we've gotten really is these explicitly Marxist frameworks that unpack the relationship between land use change, capitalism, and human and non-human contact. So Craig Mittman and Emmanuel Roth are currently working on racial capitalism in its relation to Ebola. Mike Davis and Rob Wallace have taken these explicitly kind of capitalism-focused approaches to thinking about disease and health. And Anthropocene historians have offered some suggestions as well, but these kind of rarely come with methods. This is more, I think, than just good-natured oversight. And I think it speaks to a disciplinary conservatism that has had serious effects on the way we think about, talk about, and react to epidemics socially. Public health scientists and health policymakers often rely on historical narrative when they're inform how epidemics are responded to, to determine what tactics should be employed to respond to an epidemic or to analyze it. And meanwhile, public-facing narratives of disease often seem to echo what we might think of as big man histories of disease, which espouse medical triumphalism, or the march of medical advancement and how kind of technological interventions will save us from impending epidemics. My goal in this talk isn't really to undermine the advances that medicine has made or the kind of radical technological developments of the past 2 decades. I mean, the mRNA vaccine was developed in under a year after the first case of COVID-19. And that offers a fairly sound challenge to any thought that there hasn't been medical progress that's helped with epidemics, but rather to note that while we have many medical advances, and while we have much more robust understandings of the pathology, epidemiology, and ecology of microbial infectious diseases than previously, our historical understanding of epidemics as environmental phenomena, as connected in this kind of human and non-human world, hasn't really changed in almost 40 years. We're still kind of using similar frameworks that Charles Rosenberg was using, and there's been a kind of hesitancy to include biological frames in the way that history is told. So I could get into any number of reasons why this hesitancy exists, some of which gets right down to the root of the highly contentious nature of what history as a discipline does and what its methods should be. The most suspect place to look, I think, is the debates on the philosophy of biology in the 70s and 80s, and in the history of science, centering on Richard Dawkins and Richard Lewontin's work that debated biological reductionism and the value of determinism. And while I could talk about this particular division and its stakes for historical work for a while, and would be happy to do so with Q&A, I think it's potentially safe to say for now that a good reason to emphasize the need for methodological transition is simply because an increasingly large number of practitioners of history think we should, right? So there's been a movement in history saying we need to incorporate these methods and some hesitancy to do so. However, my goal over the next 45 minutes is to convince you that given that we agree that the disciplinary myopia exists and should be remedied, that there are frameworks that need to be adapted into the discipline that are not, the best way to accomplish this is actually to look beyond history's traditional bounds and its traditional historical method, and instead look to other disciplinary domains where the question of how to best incorporate human and non-human and dynamic ecological systems and the behavior of organisms within has been a topic of theorization and discussion for decades. So thinking about the ways that we can borrow from and adapt frameworks that are already existing to help us incorporate this kind of stuff into history. So I tend to think that niche construction theory is one of the most promising frameworks to do this with. So niche construction theory was a theory developed by evolutionary biologists F. Jonathan Smith, Kevin Leland, and Marcus Feldman in the early 1990s, and the topic of considerable interest to philosophers of biology, including some who worked here until very recently and some who still do, and also to evolutionary ecologists and ecologists for a while. And so what follows is an argument about how that theory can be adapted to history. In doing so, I argue that incorporating these extradisciplinary frameworks into our understanding of epidemic disease not only renders the explicit the kind of multiple scales that epidemics happen on, both microbe to human, human to community, community to structures and infrastructures, but also that it enriches our understanding of our traditional historical frameworks and can be used alongside them to engage questions of class, race, and other forms of inequality in the spread of disease, spatial patterns, and the effects of policies in health and landscape. So this isn't an argument for switching out or getting rid of former frames in historical research, but a kind of complementary frame that I think allows us to look at biology and look at microbial agency without sacrificing the complexity of existing historical frames and analyzing these other elements. For a theoretical framework to both allow for a properly nuanced discussion of ecology, pathology, and biology of infectious disease, and to incorporate the traditional domains of historical research, I think it needs to have a few different characteristics. It would need to be able to adequately offer methods for engagement with multiple scales in which humans and non-humans factors interact to facilitate disease emergence and spread, right? So we need to think about multi-species agency. It needs to be able to adequately offer methods for engagement with cascade effects. So thinking about not just human, non-human interaction, but also the kind of multiple, the consequences of those interactions and the way that it changes the system in which organisms live. From forest fragmentation to pathogen introduction to pollution and poverty, and to do so in ways that sorts what we might consider the relevant from non-relevant factors in disease emergence, right? Because you can have a framework that has each of these characteristics, requiring kind of soft disciplinary boundaries where it can be adapted to multiple areas, incorporating multiple disciplinary perspectives, holding plural definitions and approaches for discussion across the various disciplines that are engaged in generating knowledge about these factors, and maintaining a conceptual coherence that is recognizable across those multiple disciplines. So we have to have something that's both applicable to history and also intelligible to the disciplines that we have to interact with to develop these frameworks, right? So to address, we have to have something that could address a system that's this complex. So this is a diagram from Jonathan Pax et al., developed in 2004 on emerging infectious diseases. And this is kind of what got me thinking about what kind of framework we would need. So they argue that, this is, I think, kind of a horrible diagram, but they argue that we need a couple of different frameworks to think about what causes cases of disease, some of which start in the ecosystem are kind of biologically focused or ecologically focused, some of which are more socially focused, and they all kind of come together in some human systems, right? So socio-ecological systems like agriculture, extractive enterprises, habitat fragmentation and deforestation, human settlement, land-water interfaces, the movement of populations. These all affect the emergence of infectious disease, but they all rely on both ecological and social factors, right? And so that means that we need to be able to kind of maintain a conceptual coherence in terms of thinking about social systems and ecological systems, bringing them together, and speaking about them as both having factors in cases of disease. So niche construction theory, when first proposed by Odling-Smee et al. In 2003, was intended as an interdisciplinary framework to bridge complementary concepts in evolutionary biology and ecology. It centers on the relationship between ecosystems and selection pressures through an organism's embeddedness in its environment, and argues that the use of selection pressures in evolutionary biology intentionally obfuscates the role of ecology in these systems. So they argue that the organisms interact with environments, take energy and resources from environments, make micro and macro habitat choices with respect to environments, construct artifacts, this is a quote from their book, emit detritus and die in environments, and by doing all these things, modify at least some of the natural selection pressures present in their own and each other's local environments. And that is in itself crucial in understanding the nature of how organisms and environments interact, evolve, and change. As you might have guessed from the highly non-specific nature of the definition, it's almost immediately, and since its first proposal, scientists, philosophers, anthropologists, and others have disputed the scope, definition, and nature of niche construction theory, right? So some have argued that the concept is too broad and not specific, kind of like this diagram, right? Like there's just very broad factors going on in here that are brought together through a series of selected processes, but that really could apply to just any system. Some have argued that the definition of pluralism creates challenges for the ultimate goal of bridging disciplinary gaps. The pluralism actually makes it too broad and too hard to understand across disciplines. But among those who've dedicated their research and work to pinning down a useful definition of the concept, there are a series of still quite broad, admittedly, defining features of niche construction that have emerged. So things like that organisms co-construct their environments, that the activities that organisms undertake to construct those environments have an effect on other organisms, their behavior, survival chances, and environments, that these activities and effects are constantly happening in feedback loops that create constant dynamic change in systems, that these changes can be driven by cultural and biological factors, with explicit acknowledgement that these are not necessarily separable, and that these changes have both long-term environmental effects, called ecological inheritance, and measurable genetic effects. While different scholars of niche construction will highlight different aspects of these as important, nearly all agree, and they'll highlight kind of different examples or definitions of niche construction. All of them kind of lean on the same intuitive understanding of the concept when making sense of its significance to the discipline. And they always seem to use the same example, which I find really interesting, which it's probably going to be familiar to those of you familiar with the concept, right? So let's say you have a river that's relatively fast flowing, and then suddenly, and you've got things in that river ecosystem like trees like aspen, maple, birch, and oak, grasses like alder, common reeds, white willow, and you've got river organisms, certain kinds of fish, certain kinds of birds and insects, and there are features of the river that sustain populations like pH levels, turbidity, nutrients, etc. And then, let's say, a beaver shows up, and the beaver builds a dam. when the beaver builds a dam, it floods the river ecology and it changes the types of nutrients, the types of features of the water source, and subtly and over time changes the types of organisms that can survive in that ecosystem, right? So you have the flooded trees dying and becoming new nests for birds. So there's more birds that come, bird diversity increases, new species move in, birds and insects increase diversity. You have a different kind of fish and aquatic plants. So there's more aquatic plants that grow because of the stillness. The fish can still move upstream because of the way that the dam is engineered. Sediment increases, flow decreases, carbon fixes on the bottom, and the beaver family happily expands and builds a more expansive dam network, right? So suddenly all of this changes. The example does not usually go into this much detail, I just really like the video. So what I think we need to add into this, so this is the traditional story, right? The way that I see history playing a role in this story is through bringing in certain kinds of structural changes in human activities to what's usually a non-human story, right? So let's say this is happening in northern Canada and a fur trapper shows up. And the fur trapper kills the family of beavers for their pelts, right? Suddenly that means that the dam breaks down, the river starts flowing again, the trees that were surviving in the flooded ecosystem are suddenly drying out, and the animal species change again, right? So we have a change due to human intervention. So this would be a case of human niche construction. Right? So humans come in because of their systems, economic value, they change the ecosystem, and the ecosystem reverts to a river, right? But then there's this question of why did this guy turn up in the first place, right? And the reasons behind that are actually complex and quite multi-scalar, right? So we might have, he's here in part because of the structures of imperialism, like economics and trade networks, the value of fur that develops because of these trade networks, the cultural demand for fur, national ideologies around imperial expansion, competition, technology, intercultural knowledge and exchange. You know, Native Americans tell the French fur trapper where common beaver pelts, help them learn how to track and identify different kinds of systems. And so this is all kind of like a big complex system that includes these historically contingent and quite complex socio-ecological relationships, right? All of these play a role in how this kind of dam develops, right? So in this modification, we can see that there's this increasing complexity of the ecological system and the way that niche construction can accommodate increasingly complex systems like imperial economic systems, cultural taste for fur, while still keeping our analysis grounded in the organism ecology, right? So we're still starting with beaver shows up, alters ecosystem, makes a nice ecosystem for beavers, and then humans come in and human systems intervene, right? I argue that these features and capabilities make NCT a particularly promising theoretical construct for the project of restructuring narratives of disease to better fit our lived understanding of human and non-human relationships, allowing for each part of the above diagram to be fulfilled, right? So the traditional historical story would really only focus on what's in that circle. But what happens here is important too, in allowing for this. And so niche construction theory, I think, gives us a framework for thinking about all of these together. So what I'm going to do now is kind of go through a couple of historical cases that I think show the value of thinking in this kind of framework. You have both the ecosystem and the actors within the ecosystem, as well as these multi-scalar factors from human systems and show how it allows us to look at some historical cases of disease in a different way than we might have originally. So the first case is looking at typhoid fever in Dublin, Ireland. So this is, at first glance, looks like a fairly typical case in the history of epidemics at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, typhoid fever is very common in cities across the United Kingdom. At this point, Dublin is part of the United Kingdom. And there are a series of water supply infrastructural projects that happen at the end of the 19th century to help reduce the incidence of waterborne disease. So typhoid gets, well, the microbe that causes typhoid, Salmonella enterica cerevisiae typhi, isn't identified until 1884. The connection between typhoid fever and water supplies is recognized as early as the 1860s. And so there's a series of infrastructural projects that are undertaken in Britain at the end of the 19th century to develop safer water supply systems. So this includes the introduction of sand filtration and reservoirs outside cities that deliver piped water into those cities. And across the entire United Kingdom, you see a decline in typhoid fever rates from the 1870s forward as a result of these water supply systems. This is the case just about everywhere except a couple of cities, one of which is Belfast, Ireland, and the other is Dublin. So at the end of, in the 1880s, Dr. Charles Cameron, who's the medical officer of health of the city of Dublin, goes to the British Medical Association and points out that the typhoid rates in Dublin are still quite high despite having good water supply that had just been finished in the 1870s, and proposes an extension of the waterborne typhoid theory, and argues that he thinks that shellfish are playing an important role in typhoid transmission in Dublin. While shellfish-borne typhoid will become an accepted theory by 1904, this is nearly 2 decades early that he's proposing this, and he nearly gets laughed out of a meeting of the British Medical Association because of it. The president of the association asks him if this is one of his Irish jokes, because it is so preposterous. But it is later recognized that Cameron was likely correct, and that shellfish played an important role in typhoid fever, right? So there's an interesting question here, which is, how was it that Cameron was able to identify this problem so much earlier than his counterparts? And what was the effect of him doing so on the history of Dublin? Because he basically gets dismissed as being incorrect because the theory is ahead of its time. This is a fairly normal story in the history of medicine, I think. But then what happens is that the epidemic worsens, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and cases by the 20th century, which medical officers of health attribute to the filthy habits, quote unquote, among the large classes of people that live in Dublin. So this is a pretty common refrain in the history of Dublin. And even now, when we talk about the history of the city, we tend to talk about it as a city with problems with poverty and poor sanitation. But taking Cameron's observations seriously and looking to the ecology of the city and using a niche construction lens to understand the epidemic as it occurs in this time and place, we can kind of turn that narrative on its head, this story that Dublin has been a historically filthy city, and that's why there's been so many problems with disease. So it brings us back down, if we bring it back down to the level of the individual ecosystem, actors and components, instead of taking the generalized framework and then just applying it to the city without looking at these features, the story changes. So basically, what we'll do is, so basically understanding how Dublin's typhoid epidemic was unique, why the city struggled with the disease way later than other parts of the United Kingdom, and how Cameron observed that connection, requires seeing Dublin's typhoid epidemic as grounded in a particular material environment. the biology of the Salmonella enterica typhi, the multiple scales of pressure enacted on the environment by imperial economies and local practices, and the spatial geography of the disease as reconstructed through vital statistics and historical ecological data. Together, these tell us a very different story. So let's start with typhoid, with the bacteria. So typhoid fever is a human-specific fecal-oral infection caused by the bacteria Salmonella enterica typhi. It can be transmitted by 3 methods. So public health practitioners kind of argue that there are 3 transmission pathways. One is short cycle transmission, which is transmission person to person. So that's through fecal matter going through like handshakes or hugs or handling of food. There's long cycle, which is more environmental. So that's when water sources get contaminated, shared facilities in homes like toilets get infected. And they're also proposing that there's this additional feature called extra long cycle transmission, which is where typhoid fever, so typhoid as a human bacteria is only transmissible human to human, but lives for a while in the soil. And so in Aaron Jenkins et al.'s work, he argues that there's certain ecological features and types of soil where typhoid bacteria live longer. So subcatchment basins, which are the kinds of environments where there's hills that are gradually sloping towards a river that leads out into an estuary, have been found to be traditionally better environments for typhoid fever transmission because the bacteria lives longer in the soil, being kind of a loamy, soft soil that's heavily irrigated. And the soft soil also has a tendency to kind of crack infrastructure. So you might have like stoneware pipes that crack. You have erosion issues, and all of these contribute to sewage leakage as well. So Jenkins argues that this is a big problem for places where there's this kind of environment, right? So as you might have guessed from this preamble, Dublin is in a subcatchment basin. So the position of Dublin at the lowest elevation point in the subcatchment basin, the composition of the city's soils, and its high average rainfall suggest the city might support a number of these extra long cycle factors, providing an ideal ecological niche for the bacteria. These risk factors form only part of the story, though. As analysis of medical observed health reports, government inquiries, and geography revealed, typhoid incidents reflected how humans and non-humans live within the basin as well. So it's not just the soil, but the types of organisms that tend to live in this environment that are important, right? So cockles and other bivalve shellfish thrive in this kind of estuarial ecology because these areas of the estuary are all kind of shallow tidal areas, which are really good for these kinds of bivalve shellfish. And these organisms are filter feeders, which take in and incorporate the nutrients and other particles from their immediate environment. They are, for this reason, often considered to be a canary in the coal mine of water pollution and potentially harborers of infectious bacteria. So the significance of this ecology becomes clear when it's embedded in its historical context. The cockle gathering practices, are quite rich along the Irish coast. Shellfish collection was often a leisure activity or an economical supplement to an otherwise uncolorful diet of mostly milk and bread for Irish working classes. In his report on the sanitary state of Dublin in 1906, Surgeon Colonel D. Edgar Flynn, a medical inspector for the local government board of Ireland, noted that cockle gathering and hawking were both widespread in the city, especially in summer and autumn months when typhoid fever rates were notably at the peak. Flynn noted, quote, "The cheapness of cockles as an article of dietary brings them within the reach of the poorer classes. Hence, their consumption is considerable, and a large number of people gather them in addition to those who earn a livelihood by selling them." Cockle consumption was a quotidian activity for the working classes and poor of the city, which was a socio-ecological relationship forged by the subcatchment basin and its organisms, right? So you have this kind of symbiotic relationship that's happening between the cockles who are getting food from the effluents from the city and then people who consume them. In other words, the materiality of cockles as animals and their socio-ecological relationships with humans directly affected human disease risk. A growing population meant that a large number of people supplemented their diet with Dublin-based cockles at the time of Cameron's observations. Dublin had grown enormously in the late 19th century, and people migrated to the city from the countryside in search of work, and simultaneously imperial administrators targeted it for improvement as the administrative center of Ireland for the British Empire. So high death rates in the city, often tied to its low-lying waterlogged geography, provided this impetus for the development of a main drainage scheme. By the 1870s, a royal commission called by the British government to address the city's unsanitary environment selected a scheme developed by Breyfogle, which is noted here, in consultation with Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who was the chief engineer for the London Main Drainage Scheme. So he consulted with Bazalgette's famous water carriage sewage system to design a model for Dublin. And under the scheme, a series of smaller sewers around the city connected to a larger arterial drain, which then emptied near Pigeon Forge into Dublin Bay. So basically we have a growing city where people are gathering cockles from the bay, and then suddenly we have a drainage scheme for the disposal of effluents from these people into the bay, right? The proposed plan seeds tensions between the city and the state because local engineers immediately note that this area is being used for cockle gathering, and that it would inundate this area with sewage if they were to build this scheme, which then released everything in an outfall here, which would swirl around near cockle beds. And so they advised that they don't build this system here, but instead make this outfall go further out into the bay and really catch the tides and be moved out further to sea. But for budget reasons and because Bazalgette was such a big name that they wanted to kind of defer to his scheme, they decided to go with the proposed scheme. And so that gives us a kind of understanding of the sanitary system that's interesting as well. Its development is not necessarily a result of it's not related to kind of adaptive sewage removal for the city and its environment. It's this complex, multi-scalar political tension and the prioritization of a form of knowledge in the metropole over local engineers that results in this somewhat predictable system, which is the maladaptation of sanitary systems to the needs of the city, right? So visualizations of the medical observed health data collected in the period following the construction of the main drainage scheme alongside these lines of sewers proposed suggest that the local experts' concerns were very justified. Looking at cumulative mortality rates by neighborhood between 1882 and 1940, we can see that the areas that are closest to the shellfish beds here and the sewer outfalls here, with this being the main sewage outfall and the tides flowing in this direction, lead to some of the highest typhoid rates in the city. Occupational mortality statistics also provide further evidence for the connection. Oh, here's another picture of the oyster beds. So occupational mortality statistics give us further evidence for the connection between shellfish gathering and typhoid. Because as we can see here, people who are involved in hawking shellfish and hawking food, as well as porters and laborers who primarily work on the docks where shellfish are being hawked, have the highest count of typhoid mortality. And so I think by visualizing this statistical data spatially alongside infrastructural and environmental data, thinking about the subcatchment basin, its ecology and structure, gives us a pattern in epidemiology that becomes visible that otherwise might have remained obscure. So if we just stuck to the story that Dublin is an unsanitary environment, and that's why typhoid spread, we'd miss all of this really interesting ecological data and this connection to shellfish that might have otherwise, that actually seemed to be playing a big role in the city's typhoid rates. In the interest of time, I'll skip the regulation of that one. So yeah, so this kind of rewrites the story for us of how Dublin becomes a city with high typhoid rates. And in fact, we can see after 1908, there's a significant reduction in typhoid rates after Cameron starts posting warnings about the consumption of cockles and mussels, which gives us a bit further evidence that this is in fact a big feature, right? But what about all the other ways that humans and microbes interact? Research over the last 20 years or so on the human microbiome project has led to a spate of reconceptualizations that have emerged dedicated to unpacking the implications of the findings that in each human, there's something like 100 trillion microbes and that are not human cells, and reimagining of human microbial relationships from fermentation to gut microbiome. And the findings thereof have, some believe, for all practical purposes, eroded the distinction between human and microbe on the biological scale. So we have, a framework that can accommodate thinking about infectious disease and its ecological specificity and its relationship with humans. But what about the bacteria that live inside of us and around us that are often benign or in other ways kind of bound to people? In other words, human microbial relations are expansive and their interactions are not just visible in the diseases we consider straightforwardly epidemic, but in all sorts of other cases. And so for my second case, which I will go over quite briefly because we're getting close to time, I'll suggest that a framework like EdCT also gives us purchase on these contemporary microbiological challenges, as well as the historical ones, that occur through more nuanced and anthropocentric systems. So like nosocomially acquired infections or antimicrobial resistant bacteria, and allows us to situate them in a historical perspective and understand why they're emerging now, right? So I think the case of C. diff is a really interesting one when we're thinking about this kind of complex relationship where a microbe can be transformed through its relationship with people, right? Ooh, sorry. So gut colonization with C. diff is already quite complicated because the bacterium Clostridioides, recently renamed difficile, is a naturally occurring organism in the human gut, right? So this is a microbe that plays a role in human absorption of nutrients, and it's not really known what role it plays in the healthy gut microbiome, but there's some hypotheses that stipulate that it might stimulate other bacteria to produce antimicrobial components and control the general level of different bacteria in the gut. And it plays a role in interkingdom signaling, i.e. modulating the relationship between human gut cells and bacterial cells. So the bacteria is usually kept in check by more dominant anaerobes, so the population stays at a level that is not harmful to humans. But when people are given antibiotics, particularly extremely common ones like ciprofloxacin, I'm not going to say all of these, vancomycin and levofloxacin. Yeah, it disrupts the balance of the gut ecosystem substantially, and some patients do so. And in some patients, it does so in a way that removes the organisms that provide checks to C. diff bacteria. So you end up with this gut dysbiosis that results in the overgrowth of C. diff bacteria that can cause serious infection. And C. diff is often extremely hard to treat with antibiotics, leaving patients suffering recurring bouts of infection for years and becoming sick quite quickly, so they get diarrhea, fevers, and extreme weight loss. And it's estimated that in the West is responsible for something like 5% of hospital deaths. So Clostridioides difficile infections are increasing globally as well. The largest number of infections in the US were found in the US in 2015. And it has been recognized as a leading cause of healthcare associated infections generally. I really like this little diagram. So this goes over the kind of pathology of the disease and how it comes about. And then here's an example of just how much or a graph of just how much it's increased over the last 10 years, 15 years. So there's this question, how did it go from being this common gut bacteria that was there in most human guts to a very common infection, and what's instigating this rise globally? This is from my perspective a historical question, right? And one that is not at all straightforward. It relies on historically specific ways that different care systems and pharmacological interventions developed the resources and treatment, monitoring, surveillance, and access to care in different settings, and even industrialized agricultural practices. So in the US and Europe, for example, where surveillance indicates the burden of C. diff infection is really high, there are nosocomial medical and non-medical factors that are implicated in the rise of rates. Most commonly, about 70% of cases, it occurs when someone interacts with the medical system with antibiotics or a hospital stay. But concerningly, there are also cases of hospital-acquired infection or community-acquired infection that are becoming really common. And the process looks something like this. So you have humans taking antibiotics and develop so humans take antibiotics or they develop a C. diff infection. C. diff survives the processing of sewage treatment, goes into agriculture and environment through biosolids, and then animals end up consuming the bacteria, and then it actually shows up in meat. So there's some really concerning statistic, like 30% of ground beef samples in the US have tested positive for C. diff. And so beyond these kind of globalizing antibiotics in the environment and human biosolid production or use of human biosolids in environmental production, ways and regional factors, there are also local contexts that present different risk factors. In India, for example, 15% of cases of diarrhea are positive for C. diff, but the barrier to antibiotic acquisition is much lower, and so people end up with more a higher rate of infection because of the consistent use of antibiotics. In this setting, antibiotic use both in community and hospital settings is a complex risk factor, but studies suggest that C. diff infections are still quite low in a lot of developing countries relative to the US and Europe as well. So you have this kind of complex relationship where industrial agriculture plays a role in some places, antibiotic use plays a role in other places, but we're not quite sure what level these play or what level of impact these have on these systems. Following the microbial niche of C. diff then, as emerging in places where these different factors are common, allows us to see the multiple scales that something like policy practice, environmental permeability, and medical and food cultures together might influence the development of this condition, right? So there's not just one answer as to where C. diff emerges and why it emerges where it does. And a niche construction framework also gives us a different angle to look and think about alternative and experimental medical treatments, I think. Because of mixed success with antibiotics among people suffering from C. diff infection, patients and creative medical practitioners have been turning to not always regulated methods for treatment, the most popular of which is fecal transplantation or fecal microbiome transplant, FMT. This process involves taking fecal matter from healthy donors and implanting them by various means into the guts of sufferers, either through swallowing pills or direct surgical implantation. And while some issues have emerged with this practice, including further dysbiosis, irritable bowel syndrome, and kind of long-term problems in patients, it is wildly more successful than any other treatment, with patients reporting cure for years-long chronic C. diff infection. So we have this changing idea of, by kind of changing our idea of what infectious disease is and how dysbiosis and the role of an ecosystem can affect disease, we're able to come up with these kind of system-based and alternative methods that are not as directly hands-on in some ways as antibiotics. So there's a lot of things to say about this, as you can imagine. But I think there's something inherently interesting to think about it as a moment of acknowledging the permeability of human bodies and multiple ecologies within them that influence health. So the Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer Ed Yong, in his book on human-microbial relationships, playfully refers to FMT as an ecosystem transplant, which may be more fruitful and agentive way of thinking through alternative medical strategies that bear on epidemiological and medical knowledge, balancing scientific ideas with and lay ideologies that were requiring us to devalue either one. Though this is just one angle you could approach the problem from. So that was a pretty whirlwind tour of a concept and its applications. To summarize, mobilizing more robust explanations of human non-human dynamics in history of disease could require a framework with soft boundaries, so things like flexibility and inclusivity that allow for scientific and historical methods that can incorporate multiple disciplinary perspectives, that accommodate and hold plural definitions and approaches, and that maintain a conceptual coherence that's recognizable across multiple applications, right? I think MPP seems to do pretty well meeting these requirements. It's a framework that's legible, creates a kind of story that's legible to public health practitioners, historians, and incorporates multiple forms of knowledge without devaluing one or the other. I think there are probably still limitations to the framework. It might be too broad or too amorphous. NCP is also still a really controversial framework in biology and ecology, so there's a chance that it's just inviting debate into historical methodology that doesn't need to be there. But I think that the strongest argument is still there in its application. So the way that it allows us to see these historical events in ways that are previously, that rewrite and overwrite previous stories of how disease happens in certain times and places, of the role of individual relationships and empire and ecology in those stories, and allows us to reframe certain types of epidemics in ways that are fruitful for thinking through human, non-human relationships. Yeah, so that is.
Do we usually take a break when we go straight into